If you were putting together a dream checklist of experience for a TV executive, you'd probably use the career of this week's podcast guest, Will Harrison, as the template for your checklist. Top management and media consultancy firms, check. Executive roles at media giants Time Warner and Disney, check. Managing a global media franchise like Harry Potter, done. Operational expertise built with senior leadership roles at HBO and BBC ITV joint venture Britbox, level complete. So Will and I had plenty of ground to cover on the podcast as we chatted about his fascinating career, the people who helped him along the way, and his current role running consultancy firm Seven Dials Media. Be prepared to come under the spell of Will Harrison. Hi Will, welcome to the pod.
Hey Danny, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I always like to start with a fun question, which is, in your case, Harry Potter is a franchise that you know very well. And central to the story is of course, the wizarding school Hogwarts, and its 4 houses named after 4 of the school's alumni. If you were asked to help establish the TV equivalent of Hogwarts, where students could learn the magic of TV sales and deal making, who would you name the 4 houses after and why?
Hey, Hogwarts House, that's fun. I will probably think of this through the lens of people I've actually worked with throughout my career. So my first house for TV Hogwarts would be Berger, after Josh Berger from Warner Brothers, who he first hired me when he was running the EMEA TV group at Warner Brothers, and actually hired me a second time many years later. And if you're familiar with the wizarding world, Danny, you would know each house has its own characteristics, right? So I would say students in Berger would be very intelligent and charming and extremely well networked, right? Known and liked by everyone. So that's Berger for my first house. Next house would be Bamford, after Nicola Bamford, longtime Sky exec and Endemol Sky exec, Endemol Shine, I should say. I worked with Nicola at Time Warner and she hired me to Disney. And I think students in Bamford House would be whip smart and have an infectious enthusiasm and energy and great integrity. So Berger and Bamford. I'm going to stick with B's and name the next house Baxter, after Stuart Baxter. You're nodding like you could see that coming. But see, so for those who don't know, recently departed president of international television at E1. And I'm going to say your old boss at Sony, Danny?
Yep, definitely.
And students in Baxter, they're super friendly. They're particularly good at constructing deals and using analysis to identify the levers of value, I think. And for my 4th house, to that note, I'll name Blair after J.K. Rowling's agent, Neil Blair, which seems appropriate given the question. I mean, he's broader than TV, but he does have a TV production company called Bronte. And students in Blair House are super strong negotiators and fiercely loyal. So that's Berger, Bamford, Baxter, and Blair. I'm quite happy with that. That's 4 execs I have a lot of respect for, I've learned a lot from.
Yeah, fantastic. Were you a big film and TV fan growing up? And did this influence your decision to gravitate towards the industry when you joined media and telecoms consultancy Spectrum Strategy Consultants when you left university?
Yeah, I was a big film and TV fan growing up. I think most of us who work in the sector were, right? If I think back to when I was a kid, I remember posters my friends had on their walls would all be soccer stars and fast cars and that kind of thing. And my wall had movie one sheets that I'd get from my local video store in the cinema. I'd go and badger the staff there to give them to me when they were done. So yeah, always a film and TV nerd. And I'm sure that influenced me when I joined Spectrum. I'd been doing contract work at McKinsey's and learning a bit about consulting, but it was very generalist and across all sectors, whereas Spectrum was appealing to me, particularly for its media focus.
And what did Spectrum teach you about the business of TV and media in general?
Well, firstly, it gave me the consulting toolkit that really has seen me throughout my career. And I always think management consulting is a great first job to have because you get to punch above your weight and experience level to an almost absurd degree. In my early 20s, I was presenting to the Samsung board in Korea, or building a business plan for the pay TV platform Astro in Malaysia, or doing a mobile license bid in Rome. So it kind of seems ridiculous in hindsight, given how wet behind the ears I was. But that international exposure actually was a great gift at such an early stage, because it gave me that interest in different markets and cultures. So Spectrum was terrific at giving me exposure to a range of media businesses. That's a huge learning opportunity at such an early stage in your career, I think.
In 1999, you joined Warner Brothers, focusing on biz dev for the international program sales business. How does the biz dev function fit into a program sales operation? And how did the commercial reality of a corporate organization like Warner's contrast with the consultancy world?
Business development can mean very different things at different companies, right? At Warner's then, it was a combination of strategy work and a lot of analysis and deal support. So it was working on the big output deals with Sky and so on. At that point in time, we were also taking equity stakes in some platforms like Canal Satellite Digital. So there was some corporate M&A type work as well. So that role for me was a stop on a journey that started at that strategy end of things, and that move to Warner's took me into real deal making. That's what the biz dev role gave me exposure to, and then later on into more operational managerial roles with P&L ownership. But that difference you're asking about between consulting and industry roles is really interesting, because in consulting, I think you learn to massively over deliver, partly because you're charging significant fees, and I think in some sense you're trying to justify that. But in industry roles, you get much better at the 80-20 rule, right? Less need to boil the ocean to get to an answer that's going to help you make a decision. So I certainly got better, I think, at seeing the wood for the trees and learning that less can be more, particularly when you're making decisions at speed. And also with operating roles in industry, you're living with those decisions on a long-term basis in a way that you're not when you're a consultant, when you deliver a final report and then move on to the next client.
To what extent were the team at Warner's starting to look at leveraging the power of franchises like Friends and ER in TV and DC, for example, in film, to maximize value in their TV deals at what was then the turn of the millennium?
It's always the must-have content that drives the overall business, isn't it? I was lucky enough then in that era to be at Warner's during Friends and ER, later at Disney in the Lost and Desperate Housewives era, and then later again at HBO with Game of Thrones. So it's a great privilege to launch and sell such iconic shows. But to your point, they help you maximize value in a very broad sense, just because of the leverage they give you at the negotiating table. I think you're asking about franchise management. That came a little bit later. In those days, that was just about selling the shows and getting the best price and building the best partnership with your pay TV partners and broadcasters.
So coming on to franchises, because that's something that you've been particularly associated with. What are the key elements of a media franchise? And can you pinpoint three key techniques that IP owners can employ to maximize the value in their franchises?
Well, a franchise, first and foremost, it's a property that gives you a pipeline of content. It's that returnable property with characters and worlds that can be expanded over time on an ongoing basis. But as for techniques for maximizing their value, I'd highlight a couple. The first is really taking the time to understand your brand and being able to articulate the properties and attributes of that brand and understand the appeal that it holds for the fans, so that all your decisioning can be taken through that brand lens and have that brand consistency and be focused on long-term brand health. So you're not doing anything at odds with the brand, no short-term quick bucks or partnerships that might compromise it. So really applying that brand lens to everything you do. And then the second thing, which is very closely related to that, is understanding your fan base. It's really worth doing a lot of quant research and focus groups to properly segment your fan base, by which I mean not just demographically and geographically, but also attitudinally. So you really understand your super fans and you can super serve them, but also, just as importantly, understand your lapsed fans, people who maybe used to be into your property, but now they've drifted away. Like, why is that? And what would it take to get them to re-engage? Or new fans and younger fans who maybe need onboarding onto the franchise. So the more nuanced your understanding of your fan base, the better you can develop a roadmap of products and experiences that maps against their identified needs and wants. So I think the brands and rooting it all in the fans is the key, in my opinion.
Fascinating. You've worked at two of the best exponents of franchise management in global entertainment, Disney and Warner Brothers. Can you compare and contrast how these organizations manage these assets?
Well, I think franchise management, it's evolved a lot over the last 10, 20 years. And I worked for Disney and Warner's several years apart. I think Disney's always had a cross line of business, very brand focused approach. They're like the past masters of it. But when I was there in the mid to late 2000s, I'd say it was still evolving in terms of what I would call modern franchise management. In fact, I'd credit Rich Ross, who back then was president of Disney Channels, with driving a lot of it. That was the era of High School Musical, if you recall that, which was a like hit Disney Channel movie.
We're all in this together. Well, we're all in this together.
I love it. Very good. And Rich, he really rallied the whole company around that, marshalling all the different lines of business to amplify it and to bring their reach and their different consumer touch points to bear on it, and of course develop a pipeline of sequels and so on. So that was kind of the Disney experience, mid to late 2000s. By the time I'd gone back to Warner's on the Potter franchise, that was almost a decade later. And I think by then things had become more sophisticated. And also, of course, by then the digital experience is much more at the heart of it in terms of how you engage with your fan base. And I think Warner's then was maybe a little bit later than Disney to implementing that cross-functional way of working, with the exception of DC, which was a standalone business and founded on their huge comics publishing business. The Harry Potter franchise group at Warner's, I think really was their first attempt to create a matrixed horizontal management team for a single piece of IP that went across all those vertical, traditionally somewhat siloed lines of business, theatrical, TV, home entertainment, consumer products, digital, and so on. So within that environment, franchise management involves a lot of stakeholder management, as you can imagine. But when you root your plan in a really deep understanding of the brand and your fan base, as we just discussed, that's how you create alignment amongst those stakeholders, gets everybody pointing in the same direction. And that's a kind of superpower.
Well, talking of superpowers, how important is scarcity and exclusivity when it comes to franchises? And how do you strike a balance between underutilizing an asset and overexposing it? So, talking of superpowers, have we seen superheroes, for example, becoming overexposed?
With any property, well, you're right, it's a balance. Too much scarcity and fans drift away. There are so many other demands on their time, but overexposure risks compromising quality. And ultimately, it's the quality of the material that trumps everything. Certainly, superhero movies have waned a bit in performance recently, haven't they? But these things are cyclical. And I think with the right creative quality control, they're not going anywhere.
Okay, so they'll be back.
Exactly.
To quote a different franchise. One of the many advantages of working for a global media organization is the opportunity to experience different business areas and geographies. And you took full advantage across your combined 12 years at Time Warner, and that included a role as COO at HBO Europe, which at the time had 35 channel feeds in 15 markets, broadcasting in 11 languages. How did you find being based in another country, in this case, Hungary? And what was the strategy in selling and operating such a strong US brand in multiple locations with such diverse cultures?
Yeah, at that time, HBO Europe's head office was in Budapest, which was an incredible city and still is. So I loved that. Selling a US brand in those cultures, well, happily quality travels well, and HBO has the best quality of anyone. But what we did in that era was add locally commissioned content to the mix as well. In fact, it was one of your previous guests, the great Mark Lorber, started that at HBO Europe, and that was continued by the legendary Anthony Root. But in terms of generating cut through and driving subscriptions, we found the local stories told in local voices incredibly powerful when mixed in a service alongside global quality shows. That's no great insight. It's what Netflix and the streamers have perfected, right? But back then, I'd say it was a newer strategy for those international services. We made a check drama called Burning Bush, directed by Agnieszka Holland, based on true events in the late 60s. It was about a Czech student called Jan Pelenč who set himself on fire in protest against the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia. And that show, when we launched it, generated front page coverage in the national newspapers, which is a level of cut through a national discourse that is hard to reach with imported US shows. So that mix was crucial.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I just even today I noticed or I saw that Warner's had sold one of their HBO Europe shows to the BBC.
Yeah.
And so it's it's interesting to see how those shows are now starting to travel outside of those core territories. Also interesting that to some extent it appears from the outside that the organization is stepping back from some of
I know.
those local shows. So it's interesting to hear the power of those shows in terms of driving the business. But it's also interesting at a time because a time that Warner and the broader HBO are looking at launching a new brand, the Max brand. And so how do you strike the balance between leveraging the HBO brand and launching the new brand and trying to incorporate as much local culture as possible? It feels like a tough task.
The branding question is delicate, isn't it? I'm enormously attached to the HBO brand, and you don't want to dilute that or throw the brand baby out with the bathwater. But at the same time, they're building a mass reach mainstream service with Max. They're building a high street destination, and HBO is a Tiffany brand. And so the answer has to be some very careful brand hierarchy work and positioning work that can give them the best of both worlds. There's been a lot of talented execs leave that business in the last couple of years, but they've still got a very smart team over there. They've got incredible IP and brands. I'm an optimist at heart, so I'm going to predict they'll figure it out. I'm confident they will.
Okay, well, when people are listening to this podcast and this episode in 2 or 3 years' time, they'll be able to look back and say you were right. Let's hope. In 2016, you joined the Harry Potter franchise group at Warner's as Chief Commercial Officer. What did the role involve? How did the commercial universe of Potter expand? And how do you balance commercial development with the original vision of the creative material?
I suppose I've talked a little bit about this already in terms of creating that roadmap of products and experiences and joining up what had previously been sat somewhat disparately across different vertical lines of business. The question of balance with the creative material, that's key. So the whole lens you look at this through is the long-term health of the brand. So I think I alluded to it earlier. You're not going to make a quick buck that's going to hurt the brand. So everything's managed for brand consistency, for long-term growth, and that informs a lot of your choice of partnerships. Finding partners that really understand the brand and what you're trying to do and build products and services together over the long term.
And in terms of the choices that you make or the group made in terms of how to expand the commercial operations, as well as thinking long term and thinking with that brand lens, what practical components of those decisions come in? So, for example, when I think of Harry Potter Lego or the Harry that kind of gaming experience, is there enormous amount of rigor that goes into deciding how you're going to deliver and execute on something like that and find a way to make it as consistent as possible with the overall brand experience?
Yeah, so Lego, a really good example of a great long-term partner because they understand their users really well. They take the time to understand your brand, and there's enough commonality. So they're a great long-term partner. They've been great creativity, and we knew from research that we'd done that within when I talked earlier about segmenting your fan base, that a particular group of fans and demographic of fans were big Lego users in practical building stuff, but also in their digital gaming experiences and so on. And so we knew that there was a great fit there. So that's actually a very good example of choosing a long-term commercial partner that you can build with over time. Other practical things also in the gaming space. There was a whole gaming opportunity with Potter that was unlocked with a bit of branding work. There was a David Haddad's games group at Warner Brothers created a new label called Portkey Games. There hadn't been new Potter games for some time at that point, and there was a lot of development work again around the brands, around fans. we knew from our research what do Potter fans most want to do? They want to go to Hogwarts in a nutshell. And of that one slither of insight in some of those focus groups is ultimately grown what became this enormous console game, Hogwarts Legacy, that was incredible commercial success.
Yes, indeed. In 2020, you brought together your experience in managing broadcast operations and British cultural icons to the role of managing director Britbox UK. British TV content specifically has always travelled well internationally, and the Britbox brand, which is not so easy to say, has succeeded in markets like the US in particular. How do you aim to differentiate the service, or did you aim to differentiate the service in its home market, for example?
Might be worth explaining to your listeners the difference between Britbox International, the service first launched in America, and where it was a 50-50 joint venture between the BBC and ITV, co-funded, built on the iPlayer backend, and in the UK, where it launched after America, different corporate shareholding. We were set up as an independently structured organization, fully formed joint venture, but 90% owned by ITV, only 10% owned by the BBC. And in fact, ITV was the sole funding shareholder. That was publicly reported at the time. I'm not disclosing confidences. And we were built on the ITV Hub backend. So it's very different organizationally, ownership-wise. And actually, even in terms of the core proposition, I'd say the Britbox in the UK was slightly broader than the US proposition. The sweet spot for the business at that point in the US was kind of soft crime programming, slightly female-leaning audience of a certain demographic. Britbox in the UK was broader than that. And to your point about how you differentiate it in the home market, one of the challenges is a lot of content's by definition being seen before because it originated here. I mean, it's a great privilege to have access to the catalogue of those two shareholders. But one of the things you learn in the SVOD business, as I'm sure you'll know, Danny, is having catalog is great for retaining customers once you've got it. It's great for managing churn. It's not really an acquisition driver. It doesn't make people get their credit cards out in the first place. So for that, you need original exclusive content that you can hang your acquisition marketing efforts on. So it was a great journey at Britbox because when we launched, as I said, it was archive only, but we built over time a slate of original commissions. We did a thriller called The Beast Must Die with Jared Harris and Cush Jumbo. That was one of the first productions to be stood up during lockdown on the Isle of Wight. That was terrifically well received. And we did Irvin Welsh's Crime with Grace Scott, and we brought back Spitting Image. And so one of the ways you differentiate is through that original and exclusive programming. And actually, when Boris Johnson's getting questions in Prime Minister's Question Time about his Spitting Image puppet, that's kind of money can't buy publicity. And so that was our kind of content journey with Britbox. And then the other two big areas of growth that we drove was on the product side. When we launched, it was missing a lot of product functionality, to be candid. Consumer-facing functionality, couldn't even do download for offline viewing, real kind of table stakes stuff that consumers expect, as well as what I call trading tool functionality, which is what you need to optimize that acquisition funnel. So things like vouchers and referrals and annual plans and save and win back offers. And so from launch, we had to really prioritize a product roadmap that could get those things in place. That was the second piece alongside content. And then the third was distribution, because it wasn't available on all the devices. You've got to be everywhere where consumers are. So doing those deals and integrating those devices, putting the app on those devices was sort of our third pillar, if you like. And that was a great 2.5 year journey building that up, taking our net product satisfaction, I think I'm right in saying, was like low 40s at launch when it was missing that functionality and wasn't distributed everywhere and didn't have original content, through to 80% net product satisfaction 2 years later and 800,000 subs. Though the Britbox team was really exceptional, and I learned a lot from them.
Amazing. On a broader point, because you talked about things like subscriber acquisition and the different content mix that you need to have between driving new subscribers and retaining new subscribers. Pay TV in general, whether it's linear or SVOD, has traditionally thrived on the back of must-have content, especially sport historically, and the bundling of driver content services with a broader package of channels that can serve marginal audience interest. Has the bundle irrevocably broken down now for linear pay TV channels, do you think? And are we heading for the rebundling of SVOD services by broadband and cable operators and pay TV platforms? Because it's the only model that can really make this business work.
I think it's fair to say, first of all, we got too many services, haven't we? Right? Too many subscriptions, and you layer onto that cost of living, and you can't find the show you want. Through a consumer lens, that yeah, but bundling or some form of rebundling makes a lot of sense. From a service provider's perspective, there are some other considerations. So Britbox, we launched on Amazon Channels, for example, which is a platform that aggregates a lot of different SVODs. And there's a trade-off to it. On the one hand, it's a very efficient source of new subscribers as a service provider. You know, Amazon are amazing at what they do. They've got an installed base of very qualified members who've already shown they're willing to pay for content, and Amazon's already got their payment details, so the onboarding is completely frictionless. And so those are the great benefits. You can scale a subscriber base quite quickly on one of those platforms. The flip side to that, or the trade-off, if you like, is you don't get the same level of data as when they're a direct subscriber to your wholly owned app. And also for a service like Britbox, where a big part of the value I think we offered was the level of editorialization and curation and the way we presented content on the service and gave reasons to watch. You put your content on a Amazon type platform, you're really just handing over the assets and letting their algorithm do the work. So you slightly lose something there. But from a consumer point of view, there's great benefit to that bundling. As you say, from a business model point of view too, you know, is there some way that can help regain some of the lost margin that the great unbundling has cost the industry? The answer will be a hybrid, I have no doubt.
So, having done all these fascinating jobs, you now have your consulting business, Seven Dials Media. What does Seven Dials focus on?
We do a broad range of consulting across media and entertainment, but I'd say a lot of it lines up under three pillars. The first is streaming, sort of as you might expect, given the Britbox experience. So we work across proposition development, content strategy, customer acquisition, and lifecycle management. And we've done work for a couple of European broadcasters on their streaming services, factual entertainment broadcaster, and arts programming streaming service. So streaming sort of one bucket of work that we do. Second is around content financing, pre-sales, distribution. We haven't really talked in this conversation about my time running the investment funds at Ingenious Media. That's probably a whole other podcast, but there's a sort of a deep finance expertise from there that we apply to some of our clients. And then the third piece is that IP franchise management work that we've been talking about. So most recently, I've been advising Studio Canal on the Paddington franchise, which is great fun. And there's a new Paddington movie coming out at the end of this year, which is very exciting. So we do a broad range of work, but it tends to fall into those three buckets. You can find out more at sevendalsmedia.com.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Looking back, what was the best piece of advice you ever received in your career, and what advice would you pass on to the next generation of executives coming through?
Well, we talked earlier, didn't we, about when I moved to Budapest to work for HBO. And when that opportunity came up, I was initially unsure just because of the life stage I was at. Our children had just started school, we'd just moved house. And I remember having a conversation with Simon Pollock, who your listeners might remember from A&E Networks. He's now a headhunter with Sukerman Group. And I was saying to Simon, I don't think I'm going to do this because I don't think it's the right time. And he gave me a piece of advice and he said, Will, it's never the right time to do these things. If you wait for it to be the right time, you're never going to do it. And that made me reflect and reconsider and go back and take that opportunity. And so that advice of taking opportunities when they arise and not waiting for the right time, you know, had a big effect on me and my career. Well, your other question was about my advice for others. I think the thing that's seen me through my career to this point is just to always be learning. I think that's what early consulting experience that we talked about inculcated in me, an appetite for finding things out, learning, willingness to ask stupid questions. And if you've got that curious mindset and an agile, adaptable approach to your career, particularly with the speed at which our industry is changing around us, that it will equip you well for a long and fulfilling career.
Well, finally, I always like to finish with a fun question about media. So, if you were asked to launch a new digital TV service in the UK, you would have found a gap in the market. Which service would you launch? And which three films or TV series would you use to sell the service to potential subscribers?
Okay, I think we can all agree at this point the last thing this market needs or can probably support is a new digital TV service, right? So, but if we're in fantasy realm here, I would say I have a great fondness for coming of age movies and teen movies. So I would this is probably top of mind because I showed my kids The Breakfast Club at the weekend. So I would program like a coming of age movies service, and the films I would put in there, I would put there's a movie called Columbus by Coconada, which is really just two people walking around talking about architecture, but actually is much more profound than that makes it sound. So I put that on there. I love the film Sing Street by John Carney. Do you know that? It's a musical
I've heard of
about a
it.
kid who forms a band. That would go on there. Kings of Summer is a movie about some boys who run away from home and move to the woods. That's all quite boy. So for gender balanced, I would say Haley Stanfield in Edge of 17 is that's an amazing movie, and that would be a good double bill with Emma Stone in Easy A. I could actually go on at length about this now. There's a mix for you. So I think that's the service, if we're getting really self-indulgent, that I would launch. I really like, there's a saying that the critic Roger Ebert had, which Mark Kermode is also fond of quoting. He said he referred to movies as a machine for generating empathy. Do you know that quote? And I think, storytelling has such value, giving us access to other people's experiences that we don't get and other stories. I think it's how we make sense of ourselves and our lives. And I think particularly when you're growing up, that has huge value. So I think a service like that would be a service of social good.
Amazing. Well, I think you should expect calls over the next 2 or 3 weeks of platforms asking you to put something like that together. So it sounds fascinating. Well, Will Harrison, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. From the Mouse House to Hogwarts, it's been a fascinating chat, and I think even the Obliviate spell could not expel it from our collective memories. So thank you.
Great stuff. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Dan.